Right, hi, thank you, Lisa, for really enjoyed the previous talk. And actually, there's a lot of things that I think during the questions we see some overlap. I think the difference between my talk and the ones that you've heard today is the fact that we historians have perhaps a slightly less precise relationship with methodology and data. Not that we don't think about it very carefully, we do, but perhaps taking a term from Lisa's presentation, secondary data is all we have. We are reliant on pretty much, unless you are using oral history, and I'll talk a little bit about that, you are essentially reliant on data and sources that have been collected for purposes other than your own. We are very much scavengers and borrowers of information with which we try to piece our analysis together. And what I want to talk today is I'm going to use a little bit of my work to illustrate some of the points I want to make. And forgive me if they feel rather general to you, but maybe not. Maybe because I'm so close to historical research, there is much that I take as read that often we don't think about. So I took, my title is a pun on the famous graffiti that was spotted in the walls of Paris during the student protests in '68, sous le pavé la plage, underneath the paving stones of the beach. And it spoke to me because of two reasons. It brings out the issue of creativity and imagination, which I think is essentially when you're trying to examine an issue historically, something I'll want to return to. But also this idea that actually, as we can see here, unfortunately, underneath the paving stones, there probably is no beach. And in the same way that when we rely on our secondary data, on our archives, to try and reconstruct, to try and analyze the past, we have to be aware that just by opening the doors to the archive, by opening the dusty tomes, we are going to find something that looks very much like that, rubble and dirt, rather than the bit of pristine truth that we'd like to get at. So, why protests? Perhaps I wanted to define some terms, again, something that we use a lot every day, and starting by defining what I mean by this will be useful. The way I use protest is really thinking about how political acts that take place outside established forms of political interaction. That is your extra parliamentary forms of political interaction, your extra institutional forms of political action. And it's not the same exactly as a social movement as I distinguished there. And within that, we can fit a lot. But the fact that protest is, by definition, I think in the way I define it, which is a way that covers most of the ways we talk about it, is extra-institutional, is unusual, is outside the parameters that we expect, does pose challenges to us as researchers. And that's what I want to talk about today. But also, we're talking about cities, and cities are a key site of protest, especially in the modern era. As the locus of power is transferred from other spaces into the urban space, the development of the urban space, the city becomes a key locus of protest. And there are many ways in which space and the politics of the city interact with protest, which won't be news to you. The question of the sheer population weight and network density, those things that support protests, that for protest to emerge, it needs to rely on shared identities, networks of trust, on things that some people call social capital, in order to mobilize people into something that is risky, extraordinary, and unusual. And those kind of networks, although they can be found anywhere, are present in the city and can be mobilized in the city perhaps easier than you can anywhere else. also, the potential anonymity of being one in the crowd can reduce the risks of participating in protest, and something that the city, that tension between the anonymity of the city and the closeness of the city is something that I find very important the more I study protest in urban contexts. But also cities are where so many of our symbolic spaces, Wenceslas Square in Prague there, C8, are cited. And protest is about representation, is about performance. And part of that performance is the occupation of space. And often the occupation of urban space, and occupation of symbols in an urban context. And how do I use all this? Well, my work is I'm just finishing a book called Lisbon Rising, Urban Social Movements in the Portuguese Revolution. And I'm looking at what is perhaps one of the widest and most active urban social movements or urban protest movements of 20th century European history. At the same time as the Portuguese Revolution, which brought an end to a 48-year-old dictatorship, took place, a movement composed mostly of, but not exclusively, of people who lived in Lisbon's large shanty towns and poor neighborhoods, emerged, which developed and became active over the years 1974-1976, which spread to many other European cities, was responsible for possibly the largest squatting movement, the largest movement for seizure of vacant housing in an urban context in 20th century Europe. That created and produced hundreds of elected popular neighborhood assemblies that mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to make demands of a succession of different powers that passed through government in the years of the revolution, demanding access to housing and demanding a series of urban social rights, transport, healthcare, childcare, and in many cases organizing those cooperatively. So I've been trying to understand that movement from an historical perspective. And what do I mean by an historical perspective, and why do I think this is important? I think when you interview people about protest, when you read biographies about particularly key protest events, be it May '68, Berlin, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Tiananmen Square in China, the way that they are portrayed, and not just by people referring to them, but also by participants, is in terms of the moment. Protest events have their own temporality, and I'm sure if some of you have participated in quite large and exciting protest events, you have felt that. You've felt that excitement in which time is dilated through participation, or perhaps sometimes where time accelerates, the succession of events in 1 day, 2, 3 days is extreme. And the sensation it creates is of a bubble in time, a moment in time. And so that everything becomes contained within it. That's why we talk about May 1968, the 25th of April 1974, the Portuguese Revolution. Whatever day the fall of the Berlin Wall was, which unfortunately I can't remember. And in that we lose perhaps the embeddedness of these moments in time. And the embeddedness of these moments in time in two directions. Forward, through what one of my favorite books about this, Christian Ross's May '68 and His Afterlife, defines as the afterlife of a protest movement or a protest event. Protest, a part of the intention of protest is to disrupt and create new meanings, call attention to situations, redefine a word, be it gay, queer, or black, for instance. They are partly about meaning, And because of that, they have reverberations through time in which the conflict that they generate about meaning reverberates and is reinvented, reinterpreted, and fought over once again throughout time. The example that Kristen Ross gives about May 1968, for instance, how 68 has become two things. It's become about the month of May, when in fact it's really about a long series of protests, mobilizations, and conflicts that France witnessed, possibly since the late 50s and well into the late 70s and late 80s and early 80s. But it's also about how May 1968 has become couched and reduced and obscured by a series of reverberating debates. Nicolas Sarkozy, for instance, the president of France, has blamed the financial crisis on 68 heures. And the idea by portraying the generation of 68 protesters as essentially individualistic, selfish, and morally vacuous individuals who have demolished a series of traditional French values that held society in check. Whereas on the other hand, people perhaps trying to defend 68 have looked at it in the sense of the birth of a cultural and sexual revolution, but not a political one. And doing that, she says, for instance, has restricted and minimized our understanding of what it was and what it meant to the people that participated in it. So part of our task as historians is not to see a protest event how we've ended up constructing it, but trying to recreate and use that imagination as well to try and understand what it meant to people who participated. But protest is also embedded in history. It doesn't, although there is often a rhetoric of spontaneity, of inevitability, the appearance of protest is embedded in historical time. It relies on mobilizing identities. In my case, it relies on mobilizing the identity of a Lisboner, of a resident of a particular community, of a particular neighborhood in the city. And those are not necessarily given. They are constructed over time through interaction, through mobility, through participation in local institutions and local clubs and local associations, in interactions with the state and, for instance, the municipality that defines, in fact, what the neighborhood is in many cases. And it also uses symbols, practices, and discourses that themselves have a history. We often, one of the pitfalls that we have when analyzing something historically is to assume that words have always had the same meaning. Words like rights, words like democracy. In my case of looking at the Portuguese Revolution, you have hundreds of political groups, many different neighborhood associations. They're all using the terms of mobilizing for democracy. In fact, what they mean about democracy is a variety of many different things. Some are talking about popular democracy in the sense of the Yugoslav sense of a supposed self-administering local community. Some are talking about socialist democracy in the sense of democratic centralism, the kind of democracy that existed in the Soviet Union, or i.e. not very much. Some are talking about liberal democracy, which includes the exclusion of radical groups. So we have to understand, and again, looking through understanding historical context, to try and reconstruct meaning to actions, symbols, and practices. And so how do we do this? Well, first we have to avoid and be very wary of a priori classification. If you are an historian, or if you start going back into trying to look at histories of urban protest, you will find that up until really the mid-1970s, there is a huge literature on urban protest. But a lot of it assumes essentially one thing, that most urban protest, or all urban protest, is mobilized by class identities. And you have, because it was Marxist scholars and Marxist historians who pioneered the study of popular protest, and have left us a wealth of investigation and analysis. That kind of obscures the fact that class is a very difficult concept that often we are ascribing to the past. And we are ascribing to actors in the past identities and motivations that were not their own. Now, I'll give you an example. It's something I'll put up at the end. There's one of my favorite books on urban protest, is by a sociologist called Roger Gold, who's unfortunately since died, about two very famous instances of protests, urban revolutions in Paris, 1848 and 1871. The Revolution and the Commune, and how these have been analyzed from the point of view of class. And they've always been interpreted as being uprising, a revolt by the Parisian working classes identifying themselves as workers. Now, Roger Gold used secondary data, a variety of really interesting triangulations with data that was collected for other reasons, to try and find out actually, where did people come from? And when people volunteered to serve, particularly in the 1871 Commune, and comparing the 1848 revolution with the 1871 Commune, he decided to look at the units, the military committees that were set up by Parisians to defend Paris and make the revolution. And yes, he found that 1848 was in many ways kind of a class-based. People were joining together in these little military communities, normally with their work colleagues, because people tended to live in Paris in areas that were organized around craft. So you had the shoemakers district, and the shoemakers district tended to organize its own militia, which were all mostly shoemakers and their close relatives. Same for the leather workers, tanners, whatever you want to come up with. And in that way, so 1848 was very much perhaps a class or craft-based thing. 1871, which many people assumed had worked the same way, he started doing the same analysis and actually realized that people were not organizing themselves according to craft. They were organizing themselves according to neighborhood. And what had happened between 1848 and 1871 is that the French state, through Haussmann, had, partly in response to the 1848 revolution, had raised the central districts of Paris, the working class districts of Paris, and replaced them with the huge boulevards, the Haussmann boulevards that we now know from Paris, so that people were scattered to the outer areas of Paris. And there, instead of being organized by class, by craft, they were organized according to different patterns. They were organized according to patterns of residence in much more socially mixed neighborhoods, but which over time developed their own identities, which were those that were mobilized in 1871, not to demand a working class revolution, but defend the liberties and the privileges of Paris as a self-governing city. So I went a little bit too long there, but just to give you an example of how we cannot judge what drives people to protest. We must try to recreate their motivations through a variety of means. And similarly, the teleologies of the present is going very much to what I was saying earlier, that we cannot assume that past protests, which often was a mistake, a problem with a lot of Marxist, traditional Marxist interpretations of protests, that all forms of protest were steps towards an eventual realization of a more fully free and equal society. We have to understand protest in its own terms, and it's in the terms of the past. But the problem with this is that we have to rely on this was calling the secondary data, and we have the problem of the silences of the archive. And what does this mean? Well, it means that exactly as Nissa was saying, this is data that is not collected for our purposes. Majority of archives are archives of the state. They are archives that are collated and information that is collected and categorized according to the norms and categories devised by the state. That might not be and often are not the same as those of the people that we are interested in questioning and investigating. Although there is a kind of symbiotic relationship between that often power creates its own categories. So we have to be aware to what extent by saying, that someone is, someone who might identify themselves in a variety of ways, ethnically, politically, in terms of family, in terms of migration, might be categorized as belonging to a particular craft community or belonging to a particular local community, urban spatial community. And by that process, eventually adopting those very categories. But still, we can't just assume that the archive is going to give us that. And it's not particularly because protest is unusual and extra institutional and is exactly about breaking away from the structures of interchange between regimes or power and people. So the contrast is between often the spontaneity. By that I mean not that it emerges of its own, but by the creativity and informality of protest, and the fact that the archive relies on formality and categorization. So in order to do that, we have to do what historians call reading against the grain and try and find out how, for one, we can use the material that the archive gives us to say something about the people who are studying. And questioning it every time why data was collected, what data was collected, and what data wasn't collected. And also, and this is what happened to me, in trying to reconstruct this social movement in Portugal, having great difficulty finding people to interview because the amount of time that elapsed meant that many people either died or moved away, and these being shanty towns or very poor neighborhoods, people leave very little trace, and it's difficult to find them once they move away. And I was struggling to find ways of finding an alternative voice, that one that wasn't that of power and the state, to try and understand what was going on. And my stroke of luck is that, sometimes archives and the state keeps things, even if they don't fit its own little boxes and filing systems. But often they don't know it exists. And this will happen to me. In desperation, I ordered in an archive a set of boxes that were labeled as very boring electoral returns for Lisbon in 1976. And I actually found that only the top layer was the very boring electoral returns. And underneath, some bureaucrat who'd received hundreds and hundreds of communiques, letters, petitions, and all forms of correspondence from grassroots organizations in those years, because they didn't fit into the parameters of the state, because officially you can't petition the authorities in these ways. You have to go through the formal processes. Officially, the state is not supposed to recognize the existence of self-elected neighborhood assemblies that challenge its own monopoly on representation. So they didn't know what to do with them. They just put them in these boxes and forgot about them. And by that stroke of luck, I was able to get access to a lot of material that was produced by the people I was trying to understand and interpret. So what you have to do is you have to build your alternative archive that includes the official archive, but that includes other sources, oral history being one where this possible. I also use extensively the press, but in that trying to use the press always through a process of triangulation. Always try and have 2 or 3 different articles from newspapers with completely different political leanings that refer to the same event. Using film and documentary, all of these have their own methodologies of source criticism that we can't have time to go into. But together they can give us a process of triangulation to try and understand the past. And just before you know, I don't know if this is going to be made available on the website. It is. I just put some examples of what I think are, for me, were fundamental texts in thinking about interpreting protest in an urban context and in historical perspective. From a classic, which is a classic of sociology, but it has ranged extensively over time, Manuel Castell's book on the city and the grassroots, the first great reinterpretation and criticism of traditional Marxist analysis of urban protest. Kristen Ross's book on May 68 in South Gold, and also William Sewell, a more classically trained historian who I think is one of the most interesting social thinkers, actually not just historians, working on this at the moment. So this was quite wide-ranging and vague, but I hope if you have particular questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you very much.